I'm really pleased to have been invited to take part in this workshop, so thank you to Manuel. Before I launch in, I want to say that the talk comes with a pretty hefty content warning. I'm going to be talking about sexual violence and rape myths in some detail, so I want to flag that for people in case anyone wants to step out. So I'm not really working directly in conceptual engineering and the implementation challenge. I'm very interested in these kind of questions of ideology and rape culture. And so what I'm talking today is I'm talking about an account of potentially how one way by which rape myths get perpetuated. Because I think rape as a concept is a kind of case study of interest to conceptual engineers. So rape is often offered as a kind of success story in conceptual engineering, in kind of this list of words with like marriage and salad as a word which has been successfully engineered. But it should be quite clear that that project isn't fully completed. The implementation hasn't kind of been finished as a project. So there have been changes to legislature in terms of the legal conditions for something to count as rape. We've seen the emergence of concepts like date rape and acquaintance rape, and these are good progress. However, rape myths do continue to be widespread, both among victims of sexual violence and, for instance, jurors who are evaluating sexual violence. I have an asterisk next to rape myths. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what I mean by rape myths. But what I want to talk about in this talk is one potential mechanism for perpetuating rape myths. And so I think this goes quite well with Paul's talk just before it, talking about mechanisms for conceptual reproduction. So I'm going to present an account of how certain seduction tropes, so certain depictions of seduction in media, can promote an ill-fitting concept of seduction. And I'm going to suggest this is kind of it's interesting on reflection how this is perpetuating rape myths, and potentially instructive for dismantling these effects, hopefully with some transferable lessons to broader implementation for normative concepts. So I'm going to begin by outlining the category of depictions that I'm interested in this talk for this kind of case study. And then I'm going to put forward a proposal that these depictions promote an ill-fitting concept of seduction. In the third part, I'm going to suggest that what this does is it's kind of an indirect metalinguistic influence or an indirect hermeneutic injustice, where we have one flawed concept, which is like displacing the use of another. And then at the end, I'll talk about some upshots, both in the specific of how we try and dismantle these rape myths and for conceptual engineering more broadly. I will note at the outset, I am going to present more problems than solutions in this talk. This is really more an outline of some cases to be worried about than it is terribly concrete solutions. But I think other talks have been really promising in that regard. So I'm going to start by talking about outlining this trope I'm interested in. So I'm going to begin by playing a clip. I'm using two examples of this trope as examples to work with in the talk. So I'm going to play a clip of the first example, which is a scene from the James Bond movie Goldfinger. Hopefully this will work with playing the clip. Additional content warning for the clip. It's meant to be a PG movie, but if my analysis is right, it is quite an unsettling scene. So just want to warn people of that. The clip will play for 1 minute and 10 seconds.
I'd like to think you're
Can you hear
all
this?
of this caper.
Skip it. I'm not interested. Let's go.
What would it take for you to see things my way?
A lot more than you've got.
How do you know?
I don't want to know.
Isn't it customary to grant the condemned man his last request?
You've asked for this. Get up.
Certainly. Yeah. Now let's both play.
Okay, So this is an example of the kind of tropes that I'm interested in this talk, and looking at kind of what kind of harms these depictions cause. So it's characterized by an initial sexual refusal, some kind of lack of consent, in the case of that scene, quite full-on sexual resistance as well as sexual refusal, which is then ignored. And what we have overall is a depiction of seduction. So I'm taking for granted that we are not meant to regard that scene in Goldfinger as a depiction of rape. It is very hard to make sense of the rest of the movie if we think that's what's happened. We're meant to think that this is a depiction of seduction. My second example is the song Baby It's Cold Outside, which has been a target of some controversy. I think it's a lot more subtle, so I'm hoping it kind of brings slightly different features into relief. So characteristic lyrics include, I simply must go, the answer is no. So again, we have this kind of apparent sexual refusal, whether we think it's sincere or not, persistence and ignoring the sexual refusal, and overall, we're meant to take this as a depiction of seduction. Part of the reason I'm using this as an example is the fact that it's generated controversy works quite well, because I think the defenses people issue of the song bring to light the problems I'm going to be arguing are at play. So here are the key features: ignored sexual refusal, where this ignoring the sexual refusal is depicted as seduction. I want to distinguish this from some kind of related tropes. So we might think some depictions of sexual violence or harassment kind of trivialize what they depict. I'm not interested in mere cases of trivialization. I'm interested in this kind of categorization or ignoring sexual refusal as seduction. So this does not apply to the ongoing controversy about the Pepe Le Pew cartoons. Equally, we might think there's kind of a broader family of tropes here of things like depicting stalking as a romantic expression of love. My proposed account might reveal something about those cases, but I'm really kind of just interested in this more specific set of features of ignored sexual refusal, preceding sexual contact, where this is meant to be seduction. So what harm do I think these depictions cause? How do I think they're promoting rape myths? So there is a kind of, there's a context and a history here of feminist critiques of these tropes, specifically within pornography. And I'm not really going to be able to, in the time, put myself in context there, but I'm happy to give a bit more context in Q&A if you like. My account kind of shares some features with Langton and West's influential analysis, but it has some key divergences. So a really common objection to kind of extant critiques of these tropes in pornography is the fiction objection, which just says, how is fiction going to do anything to our concepts here? We know it's fictional, we can tell fact from fiction, this just really shouldn't worry us. And it's not, in that form, it's not a terribly convincing objection, because we learn all kinds of things from fiction. Just as one example, the advertising industry would not look how it does if we were not persuaded by fiction. But it is on the person like me who wants to critique these depictions to say something about what it is we're meant to be exporting and why I think we're exporting it. So I want to suggest that what these depictions do is they're not promoting, in any direct sense, false beliefs about rape, or in particular, a flawed concept of rape, but they're doing so kind of indirectly. So what they're doing is promoting a flawed conception of seduction and cultivating a disposition to make certain inferences which obscure rape. So I want to here draw on Elizabeth Camp and her theory of perspectives and characterizations. I was very excited when Camp came up in the previous talk. So Elizabeth Camp thinks that what happens when we engage with fiction, and the way in which fiction can change our beliefs, is that we take on a perspective when we engage with a narrative. And so she defines a perspective as a kind of mode of interpretation, open-ended ways of thinking, feeling, and more generally engaging with the world. So perspectives are kind of sets of dispositions. And in particular, we can understand perspectives as dispositions to produce characterizations, where characterizations are ways of kind of structuring some information. So we can have a characterization of a person or an event, any of these kind of things. And so part of what characterizations are going to encode in the structure is certain features will be prominent. They're going to be more salient in our intuitive thinking. And that includes salience for kind of diagnostic characterizations, which should be particularly important here. And certain features are going to be more central. So we're going to think that these features have some kind of more fundamental, more explanatory role in the other features that we see. And characterizations can motivate our kind of effective and evaluative responses to this object or person or event. And so if we have two different perspectives, they can produce wildly different characterizations of the same event, which can in turn motivate very different evaluative responses, effective responses, and courses of action. So Camp has this nice analogy with visual gestalts, hence the duck rabbit here, where she kind of says that perspectives are these kind of holistic structures. So if you have one part of the perspective, it can cause the rest to click into place. So if you look at the duck rabbit and you're seeing the bill of a duck, you're not also going to see the eye of a rabbit. The whole thing kind of comes as a package. And this might not happen voluntarily. So Camp thinks that fiction can provide very fleshed out perspectives. They can stipulate a lot of details, but equally an entire perspective can be cued quite minimally. So she thinks that slurs, for instance, can cause perspectives to kind of click into place for the hearer. Since perspectives themselves are contentless, characterizations by contrast have content, they can be exported. We don't necessarily take away our belief that what happened in the fiction was real, but we can take away the way of responding to the world that we inhabit for the sake of the fiction. So what I'm proposing is that engaging with depictions like Goldfinger and Maybe It's Cold Outside requires a certain perspective, and that this perspective is going to correspond to bad dispositions and dispositions which fail to lead to apt characterizations of rape. So not to talk through all of these, I just have a couple of collages of the kind of ways that people defend these depictions. This isn't offered as evidence that most people respond this way. They're just meant to be some examples of the kind of things people will say. So on this slide, we have people's defenses of Maybe It's Cold Outside. And these are the reasons people are happy to categorize this as a depiction of seduction. They're defenses to the charge that this is a depiction of date rape. And so we have the fact that the refusal, who we'll call Mouse, because that was what the part was originally labeled. When she refuses, she's refusing for instrumental reasons. It's about what other people will think. We also have the fact that she does initially make excuses to stay. So half a drink more, these kind of things. And so these are being used as prominent features which justify characterization of seduction. We also have the fact in both cases that eventually they submit. So in the case of Baby It's Cold Outside, the final verse is sung together. This means Mouse has been won around, so everything's fine. There are similar defenses offered for the Goldfinger scene. So these are from comments under the video, the clip I showed. So it looks like a flirting scene to me. The fact that she gives in when they kiss, that justifies everything that went before. So the fact that resistance eventually stops means we shouldn't characterize this as a rape. It's a characterization of seduction. There is suggestion that you can kind of tell when she's fighting back that this isn't properly fighting back. She's putting up a fight to see if he can overpower her. So I want to suggest that I do think these are perfectly reasonable interpretations in some sense of these depictions. I think these are the interpretations we're meant to have when we view them. But I think it should also be quite obvious that these are not the kind of categorizing inferences we want people to make in response to these cues. We do not want the fact that a sexual refusal is instrumental or the fact that eventually resistance stops to be a cue to categorize something as seduction. So the fact that there is some sexual refusal and it's ignored isn't what's prominent here. And it's certainly not being used as diagnostic of sexual assault. Instead, what we have is the lack of utmost refusal, which is very central to the history of older legal standards of rape. If there isn't utmost refusal, it cannot be legally categorized as rape historically. This has now changed. And equally eventual submission in explaining the permissibility of what we see. So what I think we should understand these tropes as doing is relying on and reinforcing. So to go back to Paul's talk, acting as a kind of mechanism of conceptual reproduction of a concept of rape, seduction, rather than a concept of rape. So this is the concept of seduction as persuasion. So seduction as a kind of cat and mouse relationship that we also see. So I say cat and mouse here. The parts in Baby It's Cold Outside originally were labeled wolf and mouse. So are meant to be this kind of back and forth. So I want to say that we should see this concept of seduction as ill-fitting. So I here mean ill-fitting in Miranda Fricker's sense. She uses this to describe the idea of hermeneutic injustice. So we have hermeneutic injustice when marginalized agents have at best ill-fitting concepts to make sense of their experience. In The Ethics of Metaphor, Fraser also draws on Elizabeth Camp's work on perspective. And Fraser argues that the perspectives we take on can create and sustain hermeneutic injustice because they can make concepts ill-fitting. So for Fraser, whether a concept is ill-fitting or not is a property of its associated inferential network. Inferential network is a structure associated with a concept consisting in the inferences to and from that concept. So if we consider the inference from eventually Mouse gave in to she was seduced, this would be an inference with the output of seduction. So if we're thinking of this as a kind of directed graph, we have a node pointing to, we have an edge pointing to the node of seduction, if that makes sense. So Fraser points out that inferences can be more or less available to a given degree along two dimensions. So firstly, we have cognitive access, which is the degree of cognitive effort or mental effort some inference requires. How kind of easily at hand do we have this inference? Secondly, we have social license, the degree to which in some social context, agents are disposed to regard a given inference as legitimate, and this position is generally recognized. So a concept is going to be ill-fitting to the extent that it encodes bad inferences. Bad here meaning against the interests of some marginalized group. And it's going to be well-fitting kind of to the inverse of that. So Fraser's worry here is that when we take on certain perspectives, and she's concerned with metaphor, this can restructure the network associated with some concept. So I've suggested that these depictions are promoting an ill-fitting concept of seduction. So the idea here is that engaging with these fictional depictions requires a certain perspective on which seduction is adversarial. And this is going to make certain exculpatory inferences more salient. It's going to make inferences which justify ignoring sexual refusal more salient, and therefore potentially more available in that sense of cognitive access over time. So what I'm worried about here are inferences to a judgment of seduction, inferences which diagnose seduction. The worry is that these depictions are kind of cultivating these dispositions, which are going to lead to these, from our perspective, bad judgments, because they're precluding recognition of rape. But what I think is interesting here is that rape hasn't really come up in this perspective. What's happening here is that we're being encouraged to make inferences which pull away from the concept of rape. So we shouldn't understand this as cultivating an ill-fitting concept of rape in a direct sense. So briefly, what I think is happening is that this ill-fitting concept of seduction puts pressure on the operative concept of rape. So I'm here drawing on Haslanger's distinction between the manifest concept, being the definition we would give if asked to say what the concept means, and the operative concept, where that's how the concept is actually deployed. I figure that the operative concept should be quite central in what we're trying to do in conceptual engineering, or at the very least, we shouldn't be happy with the manifest alone, because in the case of rape, for instance, the operative concept is what's going to determine whether agents can use this concept to correctly explain their own experience, whether agents can use this concept to communicate to others and have them agree with their evaluation. So if the manifest concept of rape is apt, but the operative one isn't, this is a big source for concern. I mentioned earlier I'm going to talk about rape myths. I want to talk about a very specific type of rape myths. So we can distinguish roughly three types. This is my vague attempt at a rough taxonomy. So firstly, we might have classic myths. So I figure when we talk about myths, often we're talking about just false beliefs about something where the meaning of the concepts at play is fairly stable. So it's a common myth that the seeds are the spiciest part of the chili. That seems pretty standard. The meaning of spicy and chili isn't contested here. And we can imagine, we do have something like this kind of myth about rape if, for instance, you think acquaintance rape is rare and you're just statistically mistaken. But we might also have what I've called conceptual myths, which would be myths about rape which reveal some flawed sense of the concept. So if you think marital rape between husband and wife simply cannot occur, that reveals that the myth here isn't a false belief about rape as such, it's that you have the wrong concept in use. And finally, we have operative myths. So what I mean by this is systematic flaws in deploying the concept. And the reason I call this operative myths is that it is possible for you to have an apt manifest concept of rape, to be able to give an accurate definition of rape, and still fail to deploy it in the right cases. So Catherine Jenkins has pointed to cases where victims of sexual violence will be able to give an accurate definition of rape, but will not characterize their experiences as such, due to seemingly having operative rape myths, even if they don't kind of explicitly defend them. So the consequences for the operative concept of rape from having the ill-fitting concept of seduction: most rapes are not stranger rapes. They don't concur with this kind of stereotypical image of rape committed by a stranger, threat of force at night, with these kind of features. Most rapes are acquaintance rapes and date rapes. So they're going to share far more cues with this kind of model of seduction than with the stereotypical image of rape. The perspective these depictions require us to take things like lack of utmost resistance or instrumental reasons for issuing sexual refusal as a cue for a judgment of seduction, and as a cue for these kind of exculpatory inferences. Obviously, an inference to seduction precludes a judgment of rape. These two judgments are incompatible. And so this is bad for agents who want their sexual refusal to be taken seriously. It is bad for agents who have experienced sexual violence and want to make sense of their experience and communicate it to others. And it's also going to be really bad for when we have third parties who are evaluating the credibility they're assigning to accusations. Does this just sound more like seduction than rape? Do they think this is a feasible accusation of rape? So particularly on that final point, rape is a deeply normative concept. And what I mean by that is we've spoken a little bit about dual character concepts, where we have a descriptive element, but we also have this kind of evaluative element that's conferred by the concept. And so it seems clear that in rape's case, the normative element wins out. If we think maybe this is technically a violation of seduction, but it isn't seriously wrong, we're going to withhold the evaluation of rape. And you very often hear this kind of, oh, well, maybe there wasn't consent here, but to call this rape trivializes real rapes. So if what this perspective does is kind of cue these kind of exculpatory inferences for ignoring sexual refusal, even if the inference to seduction isn't made, it's going to suppress the kind of normative evaluation needed for an apt judgment of rape. So briefly, are these worrying depictions being cultivated? I can't fully answer this here. This is a big problem in aesthetics as well. But I think we have at least some reasons to worry that they are. One is the fact that people defend things like Baby It's Cold Outside by appealing to the actual facts on the ground in 1940s sexual politics. Another is Fraser suggests, and she draws on evidence about how conventional metaphors are comprehended, that this restructuring of the inferential network is going to be cumulative. So it's worrying that these tropes are very common. We see them a lot. They're basically cliche. What I want to draw attention to, this is more relevant to feminist critiques of pornography, is that these examples that I've used are from mainstream media. They're not pornographic, and so they're consumed collectively. So this might affect your individual response in the same way you're more likely to laugh out loud if you watch comedy around others. But even supposing it doesn't, when you consume this media, you also get information about the judgments everyone else is making, the perspective everyone else is willing to inhabit. So I've re-put social license here. The degree to which agents in general in a social context are willing to regard an inference as legitimate, and this disposition is generally recognized. This kind of common knowledge is going to be key for underpinning conventions, which is worrying both for kind of norms of sexual conduct, or if we're thinking about convention as preserving meaning. And it's also going to matter for predicting how others are going to respond to an accusation of sexual violence. As a brief note here, I also think it's plausible that certain forms of media are essentially gatekeepers for these concepts. So in the same way Haslanger talks about ideology, what is cute is maybe just in some contexts what 12-year-olds judge to be cute. So it's meaningless to disagree with your 12-year-old and say this isn't cute because they're kind of a gatekeeper on their relevant concept. I think arguably, for instance, what is romantic just is the kind of tropes we see in romantic media, and likewise for seduction. So I think this has some implications for how we try and dismantle these rape myths. So in particular, the problem isn't necessarily with only explicit beliefs about or the manifest concept of rape. It's with this kind of systematic failure to apply it in the right contexts. So the problem is operative, not manifest. So if our attempt is to circulate a good manifest definition of rape, that won't necessarily get to the heart of this issue. The issue here, I've suggested, isn't that these tropes are promoting an ill-fitting concept of rape. It's that they're promoting an ill-fitting concept of seduction, which is kind of exerting force. It pulls our inferences away from judgments of rape. So that's why I've called it indirect metalinguistic influence or indirect hermeneutic injustice. This means that if we want to tackle this problem, we likewise need to take on these indirect problems. We need to actually engage with conceptual engineering seduction if we're going to tackle these problematic judgments of rape. So there is this idea that you hear it more in kind of like writing in the 80s and 90s when the concept of date rape was being defended, that feminists are waging war on what has always been recognized as seduction. I think this should be our approach. I think this is a good evaluation, just not in the kind of tone that it's originally offered. So in particular, if we tackle individual rape myths, if we try and fight against the individual rationales that are offered to justify why this isn't rape, I think it's always going to be possible to generate new rationalizations, because the problem is instead the fixed point that this is paradigmatic seduction. Something makes this okay. And so tackling individual rape myths isn't necessarily going to be fully successful in the same way that focusing on the manifest concept of rape might just obscure the problem. Instead, we need a holistic approach. There is a kind of family of concepts at here that is at issue and that is affecting whether the concept of rape is deployed. We need to engage with a family of concepts. So the reason I offer this here is because I think this is an interesting implementation challenge, because I think even though so much progress has been made on the manifest concept, we should see that there are still these challenges, and these challenges that are going to be obscured by just focusing on that manifest concept, on these legal definitions. And somewhat tentatively, I think this is likely to be transferable to other implementation challenges in conceptual engineering, and in particular transferable to normatively laden concepts that we attempt to engineer. If these defective concepts are embedded in flawed ideologies, it's likely we might need to tackle entire families of concepts and dispositions to deploy them, not merely the definition of the actual concept we have at issue. So in conclusion, I think these depictions might cause harm by promoting a defective perspective on seduction, only indirectly affecting our disposition to apply the concept of rape. Solutions to this kind of indirect influence have to be correspondingly holistic. A narrow focus is not going to suffice to dealing with this problem. And to extrapolate, when we're engineering normative concepts, we need to engage with the wider ideological frameworks these concepts are embedded in, and the normative forces which determine whether they're deployed, not just narrowly on the definition of the concept we're concerned with. Thank you.